Hey, Ruby. Thanks for not stabbing me lately.
The American Horror Stories spinoff, American Horror Stories, has arrived, and it's time to break down all those Easter eggs in the first 2 episodes. What's going on, you lovely people? Lisa here, and it's time once again to talk about The Rubber Woman Part 1 and 2 of American Horror Stories, the spinoff of American Horror Story. Yeah, not confusing at all. You know, the spinoff, though, is just its own contained story episodes. You know, each one's going to be different, although these first 2 were a 2-parter. So if you want to see my longer recap of the events that actually happened in those 2 episodes, ending explained, whatever you want to call it, you can do that, you know, right up here or the description below. This video is just going to be talking about some of the Easter eggs and parallels to American Horror Story, Murder House, and other things. So let's just go ahead and dive in. Alright, so to kick things off, we just have the title of these 2 episodes, Rubber Woman, with the woe part in parentheses, basically referencing Rubber Man. You know, you have season 1 of American Horror Story, we have the Rubber Man, who was all throughout that and ended up, well, you know, spoiler alert, because I'm hoping you've seen the show by now, ended up being Tate Langdon. Now, this Rubber Man appears multiple times in these 2 episodes, but he never takes his mask off, so we truly don't know who's under the mask. The next Easter egg is that the first episode opens with Scarlett and her dad's driving to the murder house, and then when they arrive, she kind of looks around and we see these bones, and this little sequence is very reminiscent of the opening sequence of the first episode of Murder House. In part 1 of Rubber Woman, we also see that Scarlett puts on this rubber suit and then later puts it in the trash only to find it back in her closet. This kind of mirrors when Ben Harmon threw out the rubber suit and then Tate took it out of the trash and then used it in the pilot episode of Murder House. Now, throughout these 2 episodes, there are also some glimpses at past ghosts. Before Dr. Grant is killed, she spots a ball in the middle of the floor and hears children laughing. We see these 2 children run into the basement before she's killed by Rubber Man. Now, these 2 kids, they're the ghosts of Troy and Brian from the pilot episode of American Horror Story Murder House, the 2 who vandalized the house, and you can tell just because of their striped polos. They also appear later when Scarlett lures Maya and her friends into the basement. Also in the basement, Maya ends up being spooked by Thaddeus Montgomery, aka Infantata, the pieced together remains of Charles and Nora Montgomery's son. Then we move to the beginning of part 2 of Rubber Woman, and we see Ruby and Scarlett chasing and killing this nurse around the house. This nurse is Gladys, who was one of the nursing students to die in the house that was referenced in season 1 of American Horror Story. The character also showed up many times in American Horror Story season 1, and she's played once again in this episode by Celia Finkelstein. Another familiar ghost that appears in part 2 of Rubber Woman is Piggy Man, who Michael sees in the shower that makes him start to believe in the ghost stories of this murder house. Now, Piggy Man first appeared in AHS Roanoke and then was also mentioned in season 1, episode 6 of American Horror Story. Lastly, the mask that Ruby wears on Halloween, many think is a nod to Constance Langdon's late daughter Rose, who was born without eyes. Now, one other presence people were kind of hoping to see come back in these episodes, especially since they saw the title being Rubber Woman, was Evan Peters as Tate. This would have been a perfect opportunity to play Tate, again, make a cameo in these episodes, but unfortunately, he doesn't do that, even though we do have the Rubber Man appear in these episodes. Tate's spirit, though, is present as we see Ruby wearing a shirt that says "Normal people scare me," just like Tate used to wear, so we must assume that's the same shirt, and she got it at some point and customized it a little. How that happened, we don't know. There's plenty of years in between where they obviously could have had a fling, or she just wanted to borrow a shirt. Who knows? One Redditor also thinks that they've spotted a very blurry Tate wearing his iconic kind of green and striped sweater in the background as Scarlett pleasures herself. This is one that might be or might not be. I have very bad vision. You guys will have to kind of look at this and tell me if you think that you agree with that Redditor. Alright, moving on. We have this bathroom in the murder house. It's a popular spot. In these 2 episodes of American Horror Stories, we see Scarlett cry in this bathtub once after being humiliated by Maya, and then she's seen in the bathtub in the beginning of episode 2 with Ruby. The latter finds her and Ruby positioned much how Violet and Tate were in the bathtub scene in Murder House. Alright, our next little Easter egg or reference is after Dr. Grant is murdered. She continues to hold therapy sessions in this house and often mentions sharing the space with another therapist.
I have found a way to get some fun and relaxation while I'm here. I'm working with the other therapist who's trapped here on a book for all of us.
This is a reference to Dylan McDermott's character from Murder House, Ben Harmon, who was a therapist. Now, when it comes to familiar sounds, Rubber Woman Part 1 and 2 pulls out an American Horror Story classic. When Scarlett murders Maya and her lackeys, Patience and Prudence's Tonight You Belong to Me is playing in the background. Now, this song has been used in the series multiple times, including the pilot episode when the twins vandalized the house. Some fans are also pointing out that the event that Ruby and Scarlett go to gives them vibes of, American Horror Story Freak Show. There are other parallels to American Horror Story Season 1 when it comes to the characters. Some think that Michael and Troy paralleled Chad and Patrick. Ruby is kind of like the new Tate, and Scarlett is like a combo deal of Tate, Violet, and Constance as she falls in love with a ghost. She also has super homicidal tendencies. She wears that rubber suit, and she also has loved ones in the murder house that she stays close to even though she's alive. One last thing is that Halloween plays a big part in Part 2 of Rubber Woman, as it's the one night that the ghosts can roam free, and Maya and her friends are hoping to kill Scarlett outside of that house, so she and Ruby cannot be together. It kind of forces Scarlett to confront those bullies even though she does see them in the house. In the same sort of way, we had Halloween playing a part back in Murder House. On Halloween, Tate had to confront his shooting victims in Episode 5, Halloween Part 2. And well, that's all the Easter eggs and references I have for you this time for this first part of American Horror Stories. I'm sure that there's probably some that I missed. I really need to know if you thought that little blurry thing behind Scarlett was actually Tate or not. But yeah, if I missed any Easter eggs, leave them down in the comments below. Now, these are just, like I said, the first 2 episodes of American Horror Stories. I, off the top of my head, can't actually remember how many episodes we're getting in the first season. Somewhere around 7, 8. I'll have to look it up right after I do this, but that probably means there's going to be way more Easter eggs throughout the rest of this series. But that's all for Rubber Woman. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of my other videos, recaps, Easter eggs, sometimes interviews. If you want to see that recap that I did of these 2 episodes, Rubber Woman, you can check that out right over here. But as always, my name's Lisa. Thanks for hanging out with me, listening to me ramble, and I guess I will see you next time.